September 19, 1940. 2 o'clock hours. Warsaw, Poland. Witold Pilecki stood in the darkness of a Warsaw apartment building, watching German trucks roll for the streets below. The trucks were coming for a roundup, a lepanka, the Germans called it, a mass arrest operation where the Gestapo would seal off entire city blocks, force every male onto trucks, and ship them to labor camps or concentration camps. Most men in Warsaw were hiding, fleeing, doing anything to avoid capture. Pilecki was doing the opposite. He was standing exactly where the Germans would find him, deliberately, intentionally, because Witold Pilecki, 39 years old, cavalry officer in the Polish army, member of the underground resistance, had volunteered to be arrested. He had volunteered to be sent to Auschwitz. The plan was insane by any rational measure. Auschwitz, concentration-slager Auschwitz, was a concentration camp the Germans had established in southern Poland 6 months earlier. The Polish resistance knew almost nothing about what happened inside. Prisoners went in. Almost none came out. The few who did were either too traumatized to speak or dead within weeks from disease and malnutrition. But the resistance needed intelligence. They needed to know what the Germans were doing inside that camp. They needed to know how many prisoners, what conditions, whether an uprising was possible, whether the Allies should bomb it. And the only way to get that information was to send someone inside who could observe, document, and somehow get reports out. Pilecki had volunteered to be that someone. His superiors had asked him 3 times if he understood what he was proposing. Did he understand that getting into Auschwitz was easy, but getting out might be impossible? Did he understand that prisoners were dying from starvation, disease, executions? Did he understand that he might be tortured, shot, or worked to death before he ever gathered useful intelligence? Pilecki understood all of it. He volunteered anyway. At 2:30 hours, the German trucks arrived on Pilecki Street. Gestapo officers and Wehrmacht soldiers sealed off both ends of the block. They went building to building, dragging men out of apartments, checking papers, loading anyone who couldn't prove they were essential workers onto the trucks. Pilecki stood with a group of men on the sidewalk, hands visible, showing no resistance. A German officer checked his false identity papers. He was using the name Tomasz Serafinsky to protect his family. The officer glanced at the papers, then at Pilecki, then gestured toward the truck. Pilecki climbed aboard. He was now a prisoner of the Third Reich. This is the story of Witold Pilecki, the man who volunteered for Auschwitz, the cavalry officer who spent 2.5 years inside the most infamous concentration camp in history, not as a victim, but as a spy. The resistance fighter who organized an underground network inside the camp, smuggled intelligence reports to the outside world, and documented the beginning of the Holocaust while surviving conditions designed to kill. The story of a man who chose to enter hell, survived hell by sheer will and cunning, and then was executed by the very people he had tried to save. The story of how Pilecki's warnings about the Holocaust were ignored, how his heroism was erased from history for 50 years, and how one man's courage revealed both the best and worst of humanity. This is a story of prisoner 4859, who proved that even in Auschwitz, resistance was possible. To understand why Witold Pilecki volunteered for Auschwitz, you must understand what Poland had endured in the 13 months before that September morning. On September 1st, 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland from the west. On September 17th, 1939, the Soviet Union invaded from the east. Within 5 weeks, Poland ceased to exist as an independent nation. The Polish government fled to exile in London. The Polish military, one of the largest armies in Europe, was defeated, scattered, or captured. 6 million Polish citizens would die before the war ended. But Poland did not surrender. Within weeks of the invasion, an underground resistance movement began forming. Former soldiers, government officials, teachers, priests, factory workers, ordinary Poles who refused to accept German and Soviet occupation. They called themselves the Armia Krajowa, the Home Army, and their mission was to resist, sabotage, gather intelligence, and prepare for an eventual uprising when the Allies liberated Poland. Witold Pilecki was one of the first to join. Pilecki had been born on May 13, 1901, in Olenice, Russia, where his Polish family had been exiled under Tsarist rule. His grandfather had fought in the January Uprising of 1863 against Russian occupation. Resistance against tyranny was literally in Pilecki's blood. When Poland regained independence in 1918, Pilecki's family returned to Poland. Witold was 17 years old. He immediately joined the Polish army to defend the newly independent nation. He fought in the Polish-Soviet War of 1919 to 1920, where Polish forces stopped the Red Army's advance into Europe at the Battle of Warsaw. Pilecki was decorated for valor. After the war, he remained in the Army Reserves, became a cavalry officer, married Maria Ostrowska, and settled on a family estate in Sukercha. He had 2 children. He managed this estate. He taught at an agricultural school. He lived a quiet, normal life. Then Germany invaded. Pilecki immediately reported for military duty. He fought in the September 1939 campaign as a cavalry platoon commander. When the Polish army collapsed, Pilecki didn't surrender. He made his way to Warsaw and joined the resistance. By December 1939, he had helped form the secret Polish army, Tajna Armia Polska, one of the earliest resistance organizations. His role was intelligence gathering, collecting information about German movements, military installations, and occupation policies. That's how Pilecki first heard about Auschwitz. In June 1940, the Germans opened concentration slager Auschwitz in the town of Auschwitz in southern Poland. The first transport arrived on June 14, 1940. 728 Polish political prisoners, mostly resistance members, intellectuals, and priests. The Germans intended Auschwitz to terrorize the Polish population, to eliminate resistance leaders, to break Polish society. The Polish underground immediately wanted intelligence about the camp. What were conditions inside? How many prisoners? What security? Could prisoners be rescued? Could the camp be destroyed? But getting intelligence from Auschwitz was nearly impossible. The camp was isolated in a rural area. The Germans shot anyone approaching without authorization. Prisoners who died, and many did, quickly couldn't provide information. The few prisoners occasionally released signed statements, swearing not to discuss what they had seen. By September 1940, the Polish resistance had received fragmentary reports about Auschwitz, none reliable, all terrifying. Prisoners worked to death, beatings, starvation, summary executions. But they needed detailed, systematic intelligence. They needed someone inside who could observe, document, and establish communication. Major Jan Lodarkiewicz, commander of the secret Polish army, asked Pilecki if he knew anyone who might be crazy enough to volunteer to get arrested and sent to Auschwitz. Pilecki said, "I'll go." Lodarkiewicz stared at him. "Do you understand what you're proposing?" Pilecki, "I understand. We need intelligence from inside. I can get it." Lodarkiewicz, "Getting in is easy. Getting out might be impossible. You could die there." Pilecki, "Someone has to go. I'm volunteering." The plan was developed over 2 weeks in September 1940. Pilecki would use false identity papers under the name Tomasz Serafiński. He would deliberately be caught in a German roundup. Once inside Auschwitz, he would survive long enough to observe conditions, make contact with other resistance members among prisoners, organize an underground network inside the camp, find ways to smuggle reports to the outside, eventually escape, and deliver a comprehensive report. The plan assumed Pilecki could survive Auschwitz long enough to accomplish these goals. It assumed he could maintain his cover identity. It assumed he could find trustworthy people inside. It assumed he wouldn't be executed, worked to death, or die of disease before accomplishing anything. Pilecki knew the odds. He knew that most prisoners sent to Auschwitz in 1940 were dying within months. He knew the Germans were deliberately working prisoners to death, that food rations were starvation level, that disease was rampant, that guards shot prisoners for minor infractions. He volunteered anyway. On September 18, 1940, Pilecki spent the evening with his wife Maria and their 2 children. He couldn't tell them the truth about where he was going. The less they knew, the safer they were if the Gestapo interrogated them. He told Maria he was going on a resistance mission. He didn't say he might never come back. Maria later recalled that Witold was calm that evening, play with the children, reading before bed. If he was afraid, and he must have been afraid, he didn't show it. That was Witold's way. Cavalry officer, professional soldier. You didn't show fear, even when fear was the only rational response. On September 19, 1940, at 2 o'clock hours, Pilecki left his family and walked to the apartment building where the resistance knew a German roundup was planned. He positioned himself where he would be found. He carried false papers and nothing else. No weapon, no resistance documents, nothing that would mark him as anything other than an ordinary Warsaw citizen caught in a random arrest. At 2:30 hours, the Germans arrived. By 3 o'clock hours, Pilecki was on a truck with approximately 2,000 other men, heading toward an unknown destination. The other prisoners were terrified, crying, praying, asking each other what would happen. Some thought they were being sent to labor camps in Germany. Some thought they were being taken outside the city to be shot. Pilecki sat quietly. He knew exactly where he was going. He had volunteered to go there. The truck stopped at a temporary holding facility, an old cavalry barracks that the Germans were using to process arrested Poles. The prisoners were herded into a courtyard. German soldiers with rifles surrounded them. An SS officer announced that they were being sent to concentration slaves or Auschwitz for re-education labor. Most of the prisoners didn't know what that meant. Pilecki did. His mission had begun. For 2 days, Pilecki and the other arrested men were held in the barracks. No food, no water, no sanitation. Men packed so tightly they couldn't sit down. The weak collapsed. Some died of heart attacks or suffocation before they even left Warsaw. The Germans didn't care. They loaded the dead onto the same cattle cars as the living. On September 21st, 1940, Pilecki was loaded onto a cattle car, approximately 80 men crammed into a space designed for 40. The doors were sealed. The train began moving south toward Auschwitz. The journey took approximately 24 hours. No food, no water, no toilet facilities. Men urinated and defecated where they stood. The smell was overwhelming. Several prisoners died during the journey. Heart attacks, suffocation, trampling. Their bodies remained in the cattle car with the living. Pilecki would later write that the train journey was designed to break prisoners psychologically before they even arrived at Auschwitz. By the time the doors opened, the prisoners would be dehydrated, exhausted, disoriented, and traumatized. They would be easier to control. The train arrived at Auschwitz on September 22nd, 1940, approximately 6 o'clock hours. The doors opened. SS guards screamed at the prisoners to get out, beating anyone who moved too slowly with clubs. Pilecki climbed down from the cattle car and saw Auschwitz for the first time. It was an old Polish army barracks complex, rows of 2-story brick buildings surrounded by barbed wire fences and guard towers. It didn't look like hell. It looked like a military installation. That was the first shock. Pilecki had expected something obviously monstrous. Instead, it looked almost ordinary. The prisoners were forced into formation in the camp's reception area. SS guards walked among them, beating prisoners randomly with clubs, screaming commands in German that most prisoners didn't understand. Several prisoners were pulled out of formation and shot immediately. The Germans didn't explain why. Maybe they looked weak. Maybe they hesitated to follow an order. Maybe the guards just wanted to establish fear. An SS officer addressed the prisoners. "You are now prisoners of the Third Reich. You have no rights. You will work. You will obey. If you resist, you will die. If you are too weak to work, you will die. If you are too slow, you will die. Your families will never know what happened to you. Welcome to Auschwitz." Pilecki was given a number, 4859. From that moment forward, he was not Tomasz Serafiński. He was not Witold Pilecki. He was prisoner 4859. The number was tattooed on his forearm, one of the first groups of prisoners to receive tattoos at Auschwitz. The tattooing was done by a prisoner functionary using a single needle dipped in ink, jabbing the numbers into the skin. No anesthetic, no sterilization. Many prisoners developed infections. Some died from sepsis. After tattooing, the prisoners were stripped naked, their heads shaved, and they were forced to stand in formation in the cold for hours while the SS processed paperwork. Guards beat prisoners who shivered or moved. Several collapsed. The guards kicked them until they stood up or died. Finally, prisoners were issued uniforms, thin striped pajamas that provided almost no warmth. Most prisoners were given worn-out wooden clogs for shoes. Many clogs didn't fit. Pilecki's were too small. He would develop severe blisters within days. At approximately 1800 hours on September 22, 1940, prisoner 4859, Witold Pilecki, was assigned to Block 17. He had been inside Auschwitz for 12 hours. He had already seen multiple prisoners beaten to death. He had been tattooed, stripped, shaved, and dehumanized, and his mission had barely begun. That first night, lying on a wooden bunk with no mattress, surrounded by men crying or praying, Pilecki understood with absolute clarity what he had volunteered for. This wasn't a prison. This wasn't a labor camp. This was a facility designed to destroy human beings systematically. The Germans weren't just confining prisoners. They were killing them slowly through starvation, disease, exhaustion, and terror. Surviving long enough to gather intelligence and escape will require every skill, every bit of luck, and every ounce of willpower Pilecki possessed. He had volunteered to enter hell. Now he had to survive it. The first week at Auschwitz killed approximately 20% of the prisoners who arrived with Pilecki. They died from beatings, shootings, heart attacks, or simply giving up. The Germans called it selection through labor, working prisoners until the weak died, leaving only those strong enough to be useful. Pilecki survived the first week by following 3 rules he established immediately. Rule 1. Never volunteer for anything the Germans offered. When guards asked for prisoners with specific skills, carpenters, electricians, clerks, desperate men would volunteer, hoping for easier work. Most were shot immediately. The Germans were testing who was stupid enough to believe them. Rule 2. Never stand out. Be invisible. Don't make eye contact with guards. Don't move too fast or too slow. Don't be the tallest or shortest in formation. The prisoners who attracted attention, either positive or negative, died first. Rule 3. Find the system and exploit it. Every prison has a system. Figure out how it works, who has power, where the gaps are, then use those gaps to survive. By the end of his first week, Pilecki understood Auschwitz's system perfectly. The camp operated on a pyramid of cruelty. At the top were the SS officers, Rudolf Haas, the commandant, and his staff. They designed the camp's policies, determined quotas for work and death, and reported to Berlin. The SS officers rarely interacted directly with prisoners. Below them were the SS guards, enlisted men who supervised work details, conducted roll calls, and administered beatings. The guards had absolute power over prisoners. They could shoot anyone for any reason, or no reason, without consequence. Most guards were sadists who enjoyed inflicting pain. Some were simply following orders. The result was the same. Below the guards were the capos, prisoner functionaries chosen by the SS to supervise other prisoners. Capos received better food, better sleeping quarters, and immunity from most punishments in exchange for keeping other prisoners in line. Most capos were German criminals, murderers, thieves, rapists, transferred from German prisons to concentration camps. The SS deliberately chose violent criminals as capos because they would be more brutal than political prisoners. At the bottom were ordinary prisoners like Pilecki, political prisoners, resistance members, Jews, priests, intellectuals, anyone the Germans wanted to eliminate. These prisoners had no power, no privileges, and no protection. They worked 12-hour days on starvation rations. They slept in freezing barracks on wooden bunks with no mattresses. They died from exhaustion, disease, beatings, or random executions. The daily routine was designed to destroy prisoners physically and psychologically. For clock hours, wake-up call. Guards entered barracks screaming, beating prisoners who weren't standing immediately. No time to use latrines. Prisoners urinated where they stood. For 30 hours, roll call. Prisoners stood in formation outside in all weather. Freezing rain, snow, summer heat, while guards counted. If the count was wrong, the entire process repeated. Roll call could last 2 hours. Prisoners who collapsed were beaten or shot. 6:30 hours. Breakfast. A thin soup made from rotten vegetables, and occasionally meat, though the meat was often rats or diseased animals. Approximately 200 calories. Prisoners had 15 minutes to eat before work details departed. 7 o'clock hours. Work assignments. Prisoners marched to various work sites, construction, gravel pits, drainage ditches, road building. The work was deliberately designed to be exhausting and pointless. Prisoners would dig ditches, then fill them in, then dig them again. They would carry heavy stones from one pile to another, then back again. The purpose wasn't accomplishing tasks. It was exhausting prisoners to death. 12 o'clock hours. Lunch. The same thin soup as breakfast. 15 minutes to eat. Guard would sometimes knock prisoners' bowls over for entertainment, forcing them to lick soup from the ground or go hungry. 1,300 hours. Work resumed. Another 6 hours of brutal labor. Capos beat prisoners who worked too slowly. Guards shot prisoners who couldn't keep up. The daily death toll from work-related exhaustion was approximately 10 to 15 prisoners. 1,900 hours. Evening roll call. Another 2 hours standing in formation while guards counted. If any prisoner had escaped during the day, the entire camp stood at attention until the escapee was found, or until the SS decided to shoot random prisoners as punishment. 2,100 hours. Dinner. A piece of bread, approximately 300 grams, sometimes with thin spread of margarine or a slice of sausage. Approximately 500 calories. This meal had to last until the next evening. Prisoners learned to save half their bread for breakfast. 2,200 hours. Lights out. Prisoners slept on wooden bunks. 3 to 4 men per bunk designed for 2. No heat in winter. Temperatures inside barracks regularly dropped below freezing. Prisoners slept in their uniforms, using their shoes as pillows to prevent them from being stolen. The total daily calorie intake was approximately 1,300 calories. The work required approximately 3,000 calories minimum. The deficit meant prisoners were literally starving to death while working. Most prisoners lost 30 to 40 pounds in the first 3 months. Their bodies consumed muscle tissue. Their immune systems collapsed. Disease spread rapidly. Typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, pneumonia. The camp hospital, if it could be called that, was a death sentence. Prisoners too sick to work were sent to the hospital. The hospital had no medicine, no beds, and minimal care. Most prisoners who entered the hospital died within days. The SS used the hospital as a convenient way to eliminate the sick, regular selections, where doctors would walk to the hospital, point patients, and send them to be shot. Pilecki survived by avoiding the hospital, no matter how sick he became. He contracted pneumonia during his second month. He worked through it, hiding his coughing fits, forcing himself to stand at roll calls when his body screamed to collapse. If he had gone to the hospital, he would have died there, but survival wasn't enough. Pilecki had a mission. Within 3 weeks of arriving at Auschwitz, Pilecki began implementing the second phase of his plan, building an underground resistance organization inside the camp. It started slowly. Pilecki would identify prisoners he could trust, usually Polish army officers or resistance members from civilian life. He would make subtle contact during work details or in the barracks. A few words exchanged while carrying stones. A glance of recognition. Nothing obvious enough to attract attention from capos or guards. The first recruit was Colonel Witold Pilecki, a Polish cavalry officer who had arrived at Auschwitz in October 1940. Pilecki recognized Pilecki from before the war. They began meeting quietly, discussing possibilities. Could prisoners organize? Could they smuggle messages outside? Could they plan an uprising? The second recruit was Captain Jerzy Dwarion, another Polish officer. Then Lieutenant Konstanty Piekarski. Then Eugeniusz Obojki, a sculptor from Warsaw. Within 3 months, Pilecki had recruited approximately 20 men, enough to form the core of an organization. They called it ZOW, Związek Organizacji Wojskowych, the Union of Military Organization. The name was deliberately vague in case the Germans discovered it. The organization's goals were improve prisoner morale and survival rates, share food with the weak, protect vulnerable prisoners from capos, provide medical care where possible. The Germans wanted prisoners to feel alone and helpless. ZOW would prove they weren't alone, gather intelligence, document everything, prisoner numbers, death rates, guard routines, camp layout, construction projects. Eventually, this intelligence would be smuggled out to the Polish resistance. Smuggle communication. Establish contact with the outside world. Get reports out. Get supplies and information in. Prepare for liberation. If the Polish resistance or Allied forces ever attempted to liberate Auschwitz, ZOW would coordinate an uprising from inside, seizing weapons, neutralizing guards, opening gates. Building ZOW required extraordinary caution. If the Germans discovered the organization, everyone involved would be tortured and executed. Recruitment had to be slow, careful, and absolutely secure. Pilecki developed a cell structure. Each member knew only a few other members. If one cell was compromised, the others could survive. By mid-1941, ZOW had approximately 100 members. By 1942, nearly 1,000. At its peak, approximately 1 in 10 prisoners at Auschwitz was connected to ZOW in some way, either as full members or passive supporters who shared food, passed messages, or looked the other way. The organization's first major success was establishing communication with the outside world. Auschwitz occasionally released prisoners, usually Polish political prisoners who had completed their sentences or whom the Germans no longer considered threats. These releases were rare, and prisoners had to sign statements promising not to discuss what they had seen. But the releases provided an opportunity. Pilecki identified prisoners scheduled for release and gave them verbal messages, memorized information about camp conditions, death rates, German plans. The released prisoners would make contact with the Polish resistance in Warsaw or Krakow and deliver Pilecki's reports. The first report reached Warsaw in October 1940, just 1 month after Pilecki's arrival. The report described the camp's brutality, the death rate, approximately 10 to 15 prisoners per day, and the German policy of working prisoners to death. The resistance forwarded the report to the Polish government in exile in London. The second report arrived in December 1940. It included more details, guard routines, camp layout, estimates of prisoner numbers, approximately 7,000 by December 1940. It also included the first mention of mass executions. The Germans were shooting large groups of prisoners at a wall between blocks 10 and 11, later known as the Death Wall. Pilecki's reports continued throughout 1941 and 1942. Each report became more detailed, more horrifying. He documented the expansion of Auschwitz. The Germans built Auschwitz II Birkenau in 1941, a massive complex designed to hold over 100,000 prisoners. He documented the first gassings. In September 1941, the Germans tested Zyklon gas on Soviet prisoners of war, killing approximately 600 men in a sealed basement. And in 1942, Pilecki documented something that would change history: the beginning of the Holocaust. In January 1942, Nazi leaders held the Wannsee Conference in Berlin, where they formalized a final solution: the systematic murder of all Jews in Europe. Auschwitz-Birkenau would become the primary killing center. Starting in March 1942, trains began arriving at Auschwitz-Birkenau, carrying Jews from across Europe: Poland, Germany, France, Netherlands, Greece, Hungary. The trains arrived daily, sometimes multiple trains per day, each carrying 1,000 to 2,000 people: men, women, children, elderly, entire families. The new arrivals underwent selection on the ramp at Birkenau. SS doctors would quickly examine each person and decide, fit for work or immediate death. Approximately 75% of arrivals, anyone elderly, young, weak, or simply unlucky, were sent directly to the gas chambers. They were told they were going to showers. They were packed into sealed rooms. Zyklon B pellets were dropped through vents. Within 15 minutes, everyone inside was dead. The bodies were burned in crematoria, massive ovens designed to incinerate thousands of bodies per day. The ash was dumped in ponds or used as fertilizer. The Germans were industrializing murder, processing thousands of people per day with bureaucratic efficiency. Pilecki witnessed the beginning of this genocide. He saw the trains arrive. He saw the selections. He smelled the smoke from the crematoria, a sickly sweet smell that hung over the camp constantly. He talked to Jewish prisoners who survived selections and heard their stories about families sent to the gas chambers. In April 1942, Pilecki sent a report that would be one of the most important documents of the war, a detailed description of the mass extermination of Jews at Auschwitz-Birkenau. The report included the arrival of transport trains carrying Jews from across Europe, the selection process on the ramp to gas chambers, disguised as showers to crematoria, burning bodies' estimated death toll, 1,000 plus per day, and rising German plans to expand capacity to 10,000 plus deaths per day. The report reached Warsaw. The Polish resistance forwarded it to London. The Polish government in exile delivered it to the British government and the Allied press. And the Allies didn't believe it. The reports from Pilecki and from other sources confirming the same information were dismissed as exaggeration, propaganda, or impossible. British and American officials couldn't believe that the Germans were systematically murdering millions of people. It seemed too monstrous, too organized, too industrial. Surely the reports were mistaken. Some officials suggested the reports were Polish propaganda designed to get Allied support. Others suggested that while the Germans might be killing some prisoners, the numbers were exaggerated. Even Jewish organizations initially questioned the reports. The scale of the Holocaust seemed beyond belief. In November 1942, the Polish government in exile published a report titled The Mass Extermination of Jews in German-Occupied Poland, based largely on Pilecki's intelligence. The report was delivered to Allied governments and the press. The BBC broadcast portions of the report. The New York Times published a small article on page 10. And still, the Allies did nothing. No bombing of the gas chambers. No bombing of the rail lines. No public warnings to the German people that they would be held accountable for genocide. The systematic murder of Jews continued, largely ignored by the world that Pilecki was risking his life to inform. Inside Auschwitz, Pilecki continued his work. ZOW continued to grow. By mid-1942, the organization had infiltrated almost every area of the camp. Members worked in the camp administration, stealing documents and gathering intelligence. Members worked in the warehouses, stealing food and supplies for weaker prisoners. Members worked in the camp workshops, manufacturing weapons, crude knives made from stolen metal, clubs, even a few improvised firearms. ZOW also established a communication network with other resistance groups outside the camp. Messages were smuggled out through civilian workers who entered the camp daily to work in construction or camp industries. Money and supplies were smuggled in, bribes for guards, medicine for sick prisoners, false documents. But the organization faced an impossible question when it launched an uprising. Pilecki believed that ZOW could seize control of Auschwitz if coordinated with an outside attack. If the Polish resistance or Allied forces attacked from outside, while ZOW prisoners attacked from inside, they could overwhelm the guards, open the gates, and liberate the camp. He sent multiple reports to Warsaw, requesting coordination for such an attack. He provided detailed plans, how many guards, where weapons were stored, optimal timing. He argued that liberating Auschwitz would save hundreds of thousands of lives and expose the Holocaust to the world in a way that couldn't be ignored. The response from Warsaw was always the same. Not yet. The Polish resistance didn't have the strength to attack Auschwitz. The Allies weren't ready to provide support. The timing wasn't right. Months passed. Then years. The death toll at Auschwitz-Birkenau climbed from thousands to tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands. Pilecki watched trains arrive daily, watched families torn apart, watched smoke rise from the crematoria, and knew that every day of delay meant thousands more deaths. By early 1943, Pilecki had been inside Auschwitz for 2.5 years, far longer than almost any other prisoner. Most prisoners who arrived with him in September 1940 were dead. Pilecki had survived through intelligence, luck, and support from ZOW, but survival was becoming harder. The camp was expanding rapidly. Auschwitz I, the original camp, now held approximately 15,000 prisoners. Auschwitz II Birkenau held over 100,000. The Germans had built Auschwitz III Monowitz, a slave labor camp for the IG Farben Chemical Company. Total prisoner population across all Auschwitz camps exceeded 140,000. The death rate was staggering. In 1942 alone, approximately 200,000 people died at Auschwitz, from gassing, shooting, starvation, disease, and exhaustion. The crematoria ran 24 hours a day and still couldn't keep up with the bodies. Pilecki realized that if he stayed much longer, he would die. Disease, exhaustion, or random selection would eventually kill him. And if he died, his intelligence would die with him. The comprehensive report he needed to deliver, documenting everything he had witnessed, would never reach the outside world. In March 1943, Pilecki made a decision. It was time to escape. Escaping from Auschwitz was considered nearly impossible. The camp was surrounded by multiple layers of barbed wire fences, many electrified. Guard towers with machine guns overlooked every section. Searchlights illuminated the perimeter at night. Attack dogs patrolled the fences. The surrounding area was flat, open farmland, nowhere to hide. Approximately 800 prisoners had attempted escape since the camp opened. Most were caught within hours and shot. The Germans had a policy. For every prisoner who successfully escaped, 10 prisoners from his barracks were executed. This created collective punishment. Prisoners policed each other, afraid that someone else's escape would cost their lives. But Pilecki had advantages most prisoners didn't. He had ZOW, members positioned throughout the camp who could provide intelligence, supplies, and diversions. He had spent 2.5 years studying guard routines, identifying weak points in security and planning escape routes. And he had a specific opportunity. He had been assigned to a work detail at a bakery located outside the main camp perimeter. The bakery supplied bread for the entire Auschwitz complex. Prisoners working there were transported daily from a main camp to bakery, worked for 12 hours, then returned. The bakery had minimal security, just a few guards and barbed wire fences. In early April 1943, Pilecki recruited 2 other ZOW members for the escape, Jan Redzig and Edward Shishelsky. Both were assigned to the same bakery work detail. They planned meticulously. April 26, 1943. Final preparations. ZOW members stole civilian clothing and hid it in the bakery. They gathered food, stolen bread, smuggled supplies, enough for several days. They studied the surrounding area using information from Polish civilian workers, identifying safe houses in nearby villages. April 27, 1943. Escape day. At approximately 2 o'clock hours, Pilecki, Redzig, and Shishelsky cut through the bakery's barbed wire fence using wire cutters that ZOW had smuggled into the camp. They changed into civilian clothing. They walked out of the compound, moving quickly but not running. Running would attract attention. Behind them, other ZOW members created a diversion, starting a small fire in the bakery to distract guards and delay the discovery of the escape. Pilecki, Redzig, and Shishelsky had approximately 4 hours before their absence would be noticed at morning roll call. For hours to put as much distance as possible between themselves and Auschwitz. They walked through the night, moving cross-country, avoiding roads and villages. The distance from Auschwitz to the nearest Polish resistance safe house was approximately 100 kilometers, 60 miles. On foot, through enemy territory, with German patrols searching for them. The escape took 7 days. They moved only at night, hiding during the day in barns, forests, or abandoned buildings. They had minimal food. The supplies they had carried quickly ran out. They stole vegetables from fields and drank from streams. They were constantly exhausted, constantly terrified of being caught. On May 3, 1943, after 7 days of running, Pilecki, Redzig, and Szyszewski reached a Polish resistance safe house in the town of Bochnia. They had escaped Auschwitz, one of the very few prisoners to do so successfully. Pilecki had survived 2.5 years inside Auschwitz. He had built an underground resistance organization of nearly 1,000 members. He had smuggled dozens of intelligence reports documenting the Holocaust. He had witnessed the systematic murder of hundreds of thousands of people. And now, finally, he could deliver his comprehensive report to the world. After reaching the resistance safe house in Bochnia, Pilecki spent 2 weeks recovering. He had lost over 50 pounds. His body was covered in scars from beatings, scabs from infected wounds, and the number 4,859 tattooed on his forearm, a permanent mark of Auschwitz that he would carry for the rest of his life. But physical recovery was secondary. Pilecki immediately began writing his report. Working from memory, Pilecki documented everything he had witnessed at Auschwitz. The report eventually ran to over 100 pages and included Section 1, Camp Structure and Administration, detailed camp layout, including Auschwitz I, Auschwitz II Birkenau, and Auschwitz III Monowitz names of SS officers and guards capo system, and prisoner hierarchy daily routines and procedures. Section 2, Death Toll and Methods, estimated total deaths. Over 300,000 by April 1943, and rising rapidly methods of killing. Gas chambers, shootings, beatings, starvation, disease, exhaustion description of Zyklon B. Gassing's crematoria operations body, disposal methods. Section 3, the Holocaust, detailed documentation of the systematic extermination of Jews transport arrivals from across Europe. Selection process gas chamber procedures, estimated death rate, 5,000 to 10,000 per day by early 1943. Section 4, ZOW Resistance Organization, structure and membership activities, intelligence gathering, smuggling, preparation for uprising capability. ZOW could support a liberation attempt if coordinated with outside forces. Section 5, recommendations. Immediate Allied bombing of gas chambers and crematoria bombing of rail lines, leading to Auschwitz coordinated attack by Polish resistance, and Allied forces to liberate the camp. Public warnings to German people about accountability for genocide. Pilecki delivered the report to the Polish resistance headquarters in Warsaw in June 1943. The resistance immediately forwarded it to the Polish government in exile in London. The government delivered it to British and American officials. The report, titled Raport W. Witold's Report, was one of the most comprehensive eyewitness accounts of the Holocaust produced during the war. It provided detailed, systematic documentation of genocide from someone who had lived inside Auschwitz for 2.5 years. And once again, the Allies did almost nothing. British officials acknowledged receiving the report. They added it to the growing pile of evidence about the Holocaust, but they declined to bomb Auschwitz. The official reasons varied. Bombing the camp might kill prisoners. Bombing resources were needed for strategic targets like factories and oil refineries. Bombing Auschwitz wouldn't stop the Holocaust. The Germans would just move operations elsewhere. The best way to help prisoners was to win the war quickly. These reasons were debated extensively after the war. Critics argued that bombing the gas chambers and crematoria would have saved hundreds of thousands of lives, even if some prisoners died in the bombing. They argued that bombing the rail lines would have significantly slowed deportations. They argued that the real reason for inaction was that saving Jews wasn't a military priority. Defenders of the Allied decision argued that bombing Auschwitz was technically difficult. The camp was at extreme range for Allied bombers, required daylight precision bombing, and would divert resources from targets that more directly weakened Germany's war effort. The debate continues to this day. What is certain is that between June 1943, when Pilecki delivers report, and November 1944, when the Germans stopped using the gas chambers, approximately 500,000 more people were murdered at Auschwitz. Most were Hungarian Jews deported in spring and summer 1944. Pilecki was devastated by the Allied response. He had risked his life for 2.5 years gathering intelligence. He had documented genocide in meticulous detail. He had provided recommendations for action, and the world had shrugged. But Pilecki didn't stop fighting. In August 1944, the Warsaw Uprising began, a massive rebellion by the Polish resistance against German occupation. The uprising was planned to coincide with the Soviet advance toward Warsaw. The idea was that the Polish resistance would liberate Warsaw, then hand the city to the Soviets as a free Polish city, preserving Poland's independence. Pilecki immediately joined the uprising. Despite still recovering from his Auschwitz ordeal, despite having already sacrificed more than almost any other soldier, Pilecki took up arms and fought in the streets of Warsaw. The uprising lasted 63 days, from August 1st to October 2nd, 1944. It was brutal. German forces, including SS units and Wehrmacht troops, fought to crush the rebellion. The fighting was house to house, street by street. The Germans used tanks, artillery, and even bombers against the resistance fighters. Pilecki fought with the rank of captain, commanding a company of resistance fighters in fierce urban combat. He was wounded twice, once by shrapnel, once by a bullet that grazed a skull. He kept fighting, but the uprising failed. The Soviets, who had reached the outskirts of Warsaw, stopped their advance and watched while the Germans crushed the Polish resistance. Stalin wanted the Polish resistance destroyed. They were anti-communists loyal to the Polish government in exile and would resist Soviet occupation just as they had resisted German occupation. By October 1944, the uprising collapsed. Approximately 200,000 Polish civilians died. The Germans systematically destroyed Warsaw, demolishing buildings, burning archives, erasing the city from existence. The surviving resistance fighters, including Pilecki, were captured and sent to German POW camps. Pilecki spent the final months of the war as a prisoner of war in Germany. He was liberated by American forces in April 1945. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Pilecki had survived. Against every odd, despite deliberate capture at Auschwitz, despite 2.5 years in hell, despite the Warsaw Uprising, he had survived. But his struggle wasn't over. In fact, the worst was yet to come. When World War II ended in May 1945, Poland was not liberated. It was occupied again, this time by the Soviet Union. The Soviets had no intention of allowing Poland to be independent. Stalin installed a communist government loyal to Moscow. The Polish government in exile in London was dismissed. Polish resistance fighters who had fought the Germans were now labeled fascists and traitors by the communist regime. Pilecki faced an impossible choice. He could stay in the West. Many Polish soldiers and resistance members settled in Britain or America after the war, refusing to return to Soviet-occupied Poland. Or he could return to Poland and continue fighting for his country's freedom. Pilecki chose to return. In October 1945, Pilecki returned to Poland under a false identity. His mission: gather intelligence on Soviet occupation and communist repression, then deliver reports to the Polish government in exile. He was doing for Soviet-occupied Poland exactly what he'd done inside Auschwitz: infiltrating, observing, documenting, and reporting. For almost 2 years, Pilecki lived underground in Poland, gathering information about Soviet NKVD secret police, operations, Communist Party activities, arrests of resistance members, and repression of Polish society. He sent reports to London via underground courier networks. But the Polish Communist Secret Police, the UB Urzędbezpieczeństwa, was hunting for him. The UB was staffed by Polish communists loyal to Moscow and trained by Soviet NKVD officers. They were efficient, brutal, and paranoid. They knew Pilecki was operating in Poland. They knew he was gathering intelligence. They considered him one of the most dangerous enemies of the new regime. On May 8, 1947, exactly 2 years after Germany's surrender, Pilecki was arrested in Warsaw. He had been betrayed by an informant who had infiltrated the resistance network. Pilecki was taken to Mokoto prison in Warsaw, the same prison the Gestapo had used during German occupation, now run by Polish communists. He was interrogated for months. The interrogations were torture sessions designed to extract confessions and names of other resistance members. The interrogators wanted Pilecki to confess that he was a spy for Western powers, that he was plotting to overthrow the communist government, that he was a traitor to Poland. They beat him. They deprived him of sleep. They threatened his family. They used psychological torture, telling him his wife and children had been arrested, that his Auschwitz report had been lies, that no one remembered his service. Pilecki never broke. Despite enduring torture that rivals what he experienced at Auschwitz, he refused to provide names of resistance members. He refused to confess to crimes he hadn't committed. He maintained his dignity and his honor. But the communists didn't need a real confession. This was a show trial. The outcome was decided before the trial began. On March 3, 1948, Pilecki's trial began. He was charged with espionage for foreign powers, illegal possession of firearms, conspiracy to assassinate government officials, preparing acts of terrorism. The trial lasted 3 days. The evidence was fabricated. Witnesses were coerced. Pilecki's defense was barely allowed to speak. The verdict was predetermined. On May 15, 1948, Witold Pilecki was sentenced to death. 10 days later, on May 25, 1948, at approximately 21:30 hours, Witold Pilecki was executed by a single shot to the back of the head in the basement of Mokoto prison. He was 47 years old. His last words, according to a prison guard who was present, were, "I've tried to live my life so that in my last hour I would rather be happy than afraid. I am happy." Pilecki's body was thrown into an unmarked mass grave somewhere in Warsaw. The exact location has never been found. The communist government destroyed all records of his burial. They wanted Witold Pilecki erased from history. And for 41 years, the communist government in Poland forbade any mention of Pilecki. His name was removed from official histories. His military records were destroyed. His Auschwitz report was classified. His family was harassed. His wife Maria was denied work. His children were denied education opportunities. Anyone who spoke about Pilecki was arrested. The Polish people were told that resistance fighters like Pilecki were traitors, that they had collaborated with fascists, that they had fought against Poland's liberation. An entire generation of Poles grew up never knowing that Witold Pilecki had existed. Only after the fall of communism in 1989 did the truth begin to emerge. When Poland regained independence in 1989, historians began accessing communist-era archives. They found Pilecki's reports. They found his trial records. They found testimony from Auschwitz survivors who remembered prisoner 4859 and the ZOW resistance organization. They found letters Pilecki had written to his family before his execution. Slowly, painstakingly, historians reconstructed Pilecki's story. In 1995, Witold Pilecki was officially exonerated by the Polish government. The charges against him were declared false. His military rank was restored posthumously. He was awarded the Order of the White Eagle, Poland's highest decoration. In 2006, Pilecki was named one of the righteous among the nations by Yad Vashem, Israel's Holocaust memorial, for his efforts to document and expose the Holocaust. In 2013, a statue of Pilecki was unveiled in Warsaw. His image appears on Polish stamps. Schools and streets are named after him. His Auschwitz report is required reading in Polish schools. But outside Poland, Pilecki remains largely unknown. Most people have never heard of the man who volunteered for Auschwitz, survived 2.5 years inside, documented the Holocaust, fought in the Warsaw Uprising, and was executed by the people he tried to save. The men who survived Auschwitz because of ZOW, because Pilecki organized them, shared food with them, gave them hope, remembered him. In testimonies recorded after the war, dozens of survivors mentioned prisoner 4859, the cavalry officer who somehow maintains humanity in hell, who organized resistance when resistance seemed impossible. One survivor said, "Witold Pilecki saved my life 3 times. Once by sharing his bread when I was starving, once by protecting me from a capo who wanted to beat me to death, and once by proving that even in Auschwitz, we were still human beings who could fight back." Another said, "I saw men give up and die all around me. I wanted to give up too. But then I would see Pilecki standing at roll call, his back straight, his eyes forward, refusing to be broken. And I would think, if he can survive this, maybe I can too." Pilecki's Auschwitz report remains one of the most important historical documents of the Holocaust. It provided detailed, systematic documentation of genocide from an eyewitness who lived inside the camp for 2.5 years. Historians still cite the report as a primary source for understanding how Auschwitz functioned, how the Holocaust was implemented, and how prisoners experienced and resisted their fate. The report also stands as an indictment of Allied inaction. Pilecki provided detailed evidence of genocide in 1942 and 1943, years before the gas chambers were destroyed. He provided specific recommendations for action that could have saved hundreds of thousands of lives, and the Allies chose not to act. The question of why haunts Holocaust history to this day. Pilecki's story raises profound questions about courage, sacrifice, and the value of human life. On courage, Pilecki volunteered for Auschwitz knowing he would probably die there. He chose to enter hell because his country needed intelligence. That decision, made freely, with full knowledge of the consequences, represents a form of courage that defies comprehension. Most people flee from danger. Pilecki ran toward it deliberately because duty demanded it. On sacrifice, Pilecki sacrificed 2.5 years of his life, his health, his safety, his family, to document genocide. He survived, only to sacrifice himself again in the Warsaw Uprising. He survived again, only to sacrifice himself once more by returning to Soviet-occupied Poland. He gave everything, repeatedly, for a cause larger than himself. On betrayal, Pilecki survived the Nazis, only to be executed by his own countrymen. The people he tried to save, Polish communists, killed him. They tortured him, tried him in a sham trial, shot him in the back of the head, and threw his body in an unmarked grave. Then they erased him from history. The ultimate betrayal. Not just murder, but the attempt to deny he had ever existed. On memory, for 41 years, Pilecki was forgotten. An entire generation of Poles didn't know his name. The man who documented the Holocaust was erased by the people who claimed to represent Poland. Only when Poland became free again did Pilecki's story resurface. Memory requires freedom. Without freedom, heroes disappear. Today, Pilecki is remembered as one of the greatest heroes of World War II. But his story also serves as a warning about the fragility of heroism and memory. Heroism doesn't guarantee recognition. Pilecki did everything right. He volunteered for an impossible mission, survived against all odds, gathered crucial intelligence, documented genocide, fought in the Warsaw Uprising, and continued serving his country even after the war ended. And his reward was execution and erasure. Memory requires constant defense. If the communists had remained in power, Pilecki might have stayed forgotten forever. His report might have remained classified. His sacrifice might have been lost. Only because Poland regained freedom was his story recovered. The living must remember the dead, or the dead disappear twice, once when they die, and again when they are forgotten. Pilecki's family paid a terrible price for his courage. His wife Maria lived under surveillance and harassment for decades, never knowing where her husband was buried, unable to speak his name publicly. His daughter Zofia and son Andrei grew up in a country that called their father a traitor. They were denied education opportunities, followed by secret police, and punished for their father's heroism. Maria died in 2002, having seen her husband's name cleared but never finding his body. Zofia and Andrei became advocates for their father's memory, giving interviews, attending ceremonies, ensuring that Witold Pilecki's story would never be forgotten again. In 2012, a Polish film crew produced a documentary titled Pilecki that combined archival footage, survivor testimony, and dramatic reenactments of Pilecki's Auschwitz infiltration. The film sparked renewed international interest in his story. In 2019, the Pilecki Institute was established in Warsaw, a research center dedicated to studying totalitarian regimes and preserving the memory of those who resisted them. The institute is named after Witold Pilecki because his life embodied resistance to both Nazi and Soviet totalitarianism. The British historian Michael Foot called Pilecki one of the greatest wartime agents, and questioned why he remained unknown compared to other resistance figures. The answer is painful but clear. Pilecki was inconvenient. His story exposed Allied inaction on the Holocaust. His execution by communists was embarrassing during the Cold War, when Poland was a Soviet satellite. His memory threatened both Western and Eastern narratives about World War II. Only when those political considerations faded could Pilecki's true story emerge. The Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum in Poland includes exhibits about Pilecki and the ZOW resistance organization. Visitors can see the barrack where Pilecki lived as prisoner 4859. They can walk the paths he walked, stand where he stood during roll calls, see the death wall where thousands were executed while Pilecki documented their murders. The museum's archives contain letters written by Pilecki ZOW members, prisoners who survived Auschwitz and testified about the resistance organization that had given them hope. One letter, written in 1965 by a survivor named Stanislav Dubois, reads, "I owe my life to Witold Pilecki, not because he saved me from the gas chamber. I was young and strong enough to pass selection. He saved me because he proved that resistance was possible. In Auschwitz, the Germans wanted us to feel helpless, to believe that resistance was futile, that we were already dead. Witold showed us we were wrong. Even in hell, we could organize. We could fight back. We could maintain our humanity. That knowledge kept me alive when I wanted to die." Another survivor, Edmund Shishelsky, who escaped with Pilecki in 1943, wrote in his memoir, "Witold Pilecki was the bravest man I ever knew. Not because he was fearless. I saw him afraid many times at Auschwitz. But because he was afraid and acted anyway. Courage isn't the absence of fear. Courage is doing what must be done despite being terrified. Witold was terrified every day at Auschwitz. And every day, he did what needed to be done. The statistics of Pilecki's Auschwitz mission are staggering. 913 days inside Auschwitz, September 22, 1940 to April 27, 1943. Approximately 1,000 ZOW members at the organization's peak, dozens of intelligence reports smuggled out documenting the Holocaust, thousands of prisoners, helped by ZOW through food sharing, medical care, and protection, 3 successful escapees, including Pilecki himself, one of fewer than 150 successful escapes from Auschwitz during the entire war. During Pilecki's time inside Auschwitz, approximately 150,000 prisoners died. He witnessed the evolution of the camp from a brutal prison into an industrial death factory. He documented the transition from killing by shooting, beating, and starvation to killing by gas chamber. He saw the Holocaust begin, and he survived to tell about it, only to be killed by firing squad 3 years after the war ended. The moral complexity of Pilecki's story defies simple conclusions. Was his Auschwitz mission successful? He survived and delivered detailed intelligence. But the Allies didn't act on that intelligence. Hundreds of thousands died while his reports sat on desks in London and Washington. Did his mission fail, or did he succeed in the only way possible, documenting the truth so that future generations would know what happened? The Holocaust is not a mystery because of people like Pilecki. We know how it functioned, how many died, how the Germans implemented genocide, because witnesses like Pilecki documented in real time. Was his return to Poland after the war courageous or foolish? He knew the Soviets were hunting resistance members. He knew he was walking into danger. But he couldn't abandon Poland to Soviet occupation any more than he could abandon it to Nazi occupation. Was that courage or a death wish? Perhaps it was both. Perhaps Pilecki understood that some things were worth dying for, and that includes the truth. He died gathering intelligence about Soviet crimes just as he risked his life gathering intelligence about Nazi crimes. Consistency of principle, even when that consistency led to his death. The legacy of Witold Pilecki extends beyond his personal story. He represents a type of heroism that modern society struggles to understand. Heroism without expectation of reward, recognition, or even survival. Heroism driven purely by duty. Modern heroes often have clear motivations: saving a specific person, achieving a specific goal, receiving specific recognition. Pilecki's motivation was abstract: serving Poland, documenting truth, resisting tyranny. He knew he might die without accomplishing anything. He knew he might be forgotten. He did it anyway. That type of heroism is rare. It requires a worldview where duty outweighs self-interest, where principle matters more than survival, where serving a cause larger than yourself justifies any sacrifice. Pilecki's worldview was shaped by his upbringing: Polish Catholic, military tradition, family history of resistance to Russian occupation. But it was tested and proven in the crucible of Auschwitz. Anyone can talk about honor and duty. Pilecki lived it in the most extreme circumstances imaginable. The question Pilecki's story poses to modern readers is uncomfortable. Would you make the choices he made? Would you volunteer for Auschwitz if your country needed intelligence? Would you risk everything to document genocide, knowing the world might ignore your reports? Would you return to certain danger because duty demanded it? Most people, if honest, would answer no. Most people would choose safety. That doesn't make them cowards. It makes them human. Pilecki's choices were superhuman, in the sense that they transcended normal human self-preservation instincts. But Pilecki would reject that characterization. In his writings, he consistently portrayed himself as an ordinary soldier doing his duty. He downplayed his courage, emphasized the contributions of others, and insisted that anyone in his position would have done the same. That's false modesty. Most people in Pilecki's position died without accomplishing anything. Pilecki not only survived but built an organization, gathered intelligence, documented genocide, and escaped. That's not ordinary. That's extraordinary. Yet his insistence on ordinariness reveals something important about heroism. Heroes often don't see themselves as heroes. They see themselves as people doing what needs to be done. The external observer recognizes a heroism. The person living it just sees necessity. In the final accounting, Witold Pilecki's life was defined by 3 voluntary decisions, each one potentially fatal. First decision, September 1940. Volunteer to be arrested and sent to Auschwitz to gather intelligence. Result, 913 days in hell, documented the Holocaust, built a resistance organization, escaped successfully. Second decision, August 1944. Joined the Warsaw Uprising despite still recovering from Auschwitz. Result, 63 days of urban combat, wounded twice, captured and sent to POW camp, liberated by Americans. Third decision, October 1945. Return to Soviet-occupied Poland to gather intelligence on communist repression. Result, arrested, tortured, executed, erased from history. 3 times, Pilecki chose danger over safety. 3 times, he chose duty over survival. Twice, he survived against impossible odds. The 3rd time, his luck ran out. But even his death served a purpose. Pilecki's execution and the communist attempt to erase him exposed the nature of the Soviet regime. When the truth finally emerged after 1989, Pilecki became a symbol of resistance to totalitarianism, both Nazi and Soviet. His story proved that the communists who claimed to have liberated Poland were just another form of tyranny. Today, visitors to Warsaw can see multiple memorials to Witold Pilecki. A statue at the intersection of Wacław and Madelinskiego Streets, a plaque at the building where he was arrested in 1947, a memorial at Mokotów prison, where he was executed, is named on the tomb of the unknown soldier. Every year on May 25th, the anniversary of his execution, ceremonies are held in Warsaw to honor his memory. Veterans organizations, military units, and ordinary citizens gather to remember the man who volunteered for Auschwitz. In 2013, a documentary film titled The Auschwitz Volunteer was produced, featuring interviews with historians, Auschwitz survivors, and Pilecki's family. The film has been translated into multiple languages and shown internationally, finally bringing Pilecki's story to a global audience. In 2021, a Polish petition with over 100,000 signatures was submitted to UNESCO, requesting that Witold Pilecki be included in the organization's Memory of the World Register, a list of documentary heritage of global significance. The petition argued that Pilecki's Auschwitz report is one of the most important documents of the 20th century. The legacy continues to grow. Every year, more people discover Pilecki's story. Every year, his example inspires new generations to question what they would do in similar circumstances. But perhaps the most fitting memorial to Witold Pilecki isn't a statue or a museum. It's the fact that we know the truth about Auschwitz. We know how the Holocaust functioned because people like Pilecki documented it in real time. We know that resistance was possible because Pilecki proved it was possible. The Nazis wanted the Holocaust to be hidden, denied, forgotten. The communists wanted Pilecki to be hidden, denied, forgotten. Both failed. The truth survived because people like Pilecki risked everything to document it. In his final letter to his wife Maria, written shortly before his execution, Pilecki wrote, "I tried to live my life in such a way that in my final hour I could be happy rather than afraid. I am happy. I served Poland as well as I could. I did my duty. I ask only that you tell our children I love them and that they should serve Poland as I did, not because Poland will reward them, but because Poland deserves service regardless of reward." Those words, written by a man awaiting execution in a communist prison, capture the essence of Witold Pilecki's life. Service without expectation of reward, duty without calculation of cost, courage without concern for consequences. On September 19th, 1940, Witold Pilecki stood on a Warsaw street and allowed himself to be arrested. He knew where he was going. He knew he might never return. He volunteered anyway. For 913 days, he survived Auschwitz. He built a resistance organization. He documented genocide. He proved that even in hell, humanity could survive. He escaped. He fought. He reported. He tried to save others. And in the end, he was murdered by the people he tried to save. His body was thrown in an unmarked grave. His name was erased from history. His family suffered for his heroism. But the truth survived. And today, we remember prisoner 4859. Witold Pilecki, the man who volunteered for Auschwitz, survived hell and proved that courage, honor, and duty can exist even in the darkest places humanity has ever created. He chose to enter hell. He survived hell, and he was betrayed by history. But history has remembered him at last. Rest in peace, Captain Witold Pilecki, Auschwitz Volunteer, Prisoner 4859, hero of Poland, hero of humanity, mission accomplished.